Hi, welcome to Module 8, Discrimination and America's Failure to Lower its Poverty Rate. What this chapter is all about is a combination of Chapter 4 and Chapter 5 of your textbook. Who is dependent on welfare? The video that is in PowerPoint 2 is a video produced by Professor Roy of UCLA, and she's challenging us all to think about, in reality, are the poor who are often demonized the only people who depend on welfare, or there's another group that we overlook? If you have some time, please watch that video. It has some important issues that perhaps you can use in your discussion to improve the discourse. So let's look at the overview of the chapter. The first thing that you have to know is to understand what are the various explanations and theories of poverty in America. The question is not that we don't know what causes poverty, but there are various schools of thought that explain why we have poverty. The second thing is, how big is the problem? What's the scope of poverty? And what are the effects? Who does poverty affect mostly? And why does it affect that population, of the segment of population? Third, examine a comparative analysis between the US and other developed nations. In other words, see how other nations are dealing with this social problem of poverty. Look at the anti-poverty measure the government has instituted or put in place. For many, many decades, the United States government has tried to create some measures to ameliorate this problem. What are those measures? Understand them. Then the other thing is the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act of 1996 that was put forward and signed into law by President Bill Clinton. When he signed that law, President Clinton basically said that law was going to end welfare as we know it. We know what it did. We are going to talk more about that. What's the poverty pipeline? Who is poor? So those are about 7 bullets that you need to understand as we move forward. So basically the overall thesis of the chapter is that discrimination and poverty are two things that are inextricably linked to the African American social welfare. In other words, the authors of the book are saying, well, yes, we have poverty, but there's some intersection between poverty and discrimination. The second point is that economic, social, and political discrimination often lead to poverty. In other words, basically that's the argument that if we have economic discrimination, social discrimination, or even political discrimination, those things could lead to poverty. And so if policymakers hope that if discrimination practices and attitudes are curtailed or solved by creating equal opportunities for everyone, then we could have success in dealing with poverty. Look at your page 6 of your text and see what types of discrimination the text discusses. So, discrimination in the US society is a very complex thing. But we know very well that discrimination has moral, it has social, it has theological underpinnings. Think about how those things play around. There are general theories to explain why people discriminate against other people. You have 3 broad theories. The first theory is that the psychological interpretation of why discrimination occurs. The second theory is normative cultural explanation of the way we are socialized. And the third theory is that people discriminate because of economic reasons. We're going to look at each and every one of those theories and see how it plays around. So the psychological theories that there is some intrapsychic variable that makes people discriminate other people. This theory was put forward by Dollard, that when some segment of population is frustrated, then the psychic is activated because the individual needs of one population are not met. And if the needs of one population are not met, they often blame another subpopulation. A book gives example of the poor southern whites. But today we can actually give example of perhaps immigrants, where we see that today we are discussing about immigration and that immigrants are coming here and are taking our jobs. So they say this other theory, which is called the authoritarian personality theory. This is that behavior determined by personality trait, which involves reaction to authority. This one basically saying that discrimination has no explanation, that people just do it for irrational reason or for rigidity or conformity to some traditions. And so they come up with all sorts of behaviors, phobia or discrimination tendencies. The second theory is normative culture theory, that people are prejudiced because of their socialization, that we are socialized from the beginning, from our families, from our communities, to be discriminative. And this is through overt, in its open ways, or covert messages that we receive that the society teaches us. The third theory was economic theories, that the dominant groups discriminate to maintain economic and political advantage. Relative group advantages gained from discriminating. For example, in the apartheid South Africa, where the minority dominated the society, they dominated because they control the economy, they control the industry, they control everything else. And so for that economic, they were not really ready to give up their dominance. A good example in the book is male worker versus female workers, where sometimes male workers may not advocate for high wages for female workers for whatever reason. It could have all sorts of explanation. There is this test question that you need to remember. I think the book asks that Equal Rights Amendment was defeated in 1982, and that amendment would have given women equal rights to public employment. But that is a perfect example where male basically voted down for something that anyone today will agree with, that half of the population should be paid equally as men. Let's look at discrimination in American society. Who is discriminated against? When you look at the median household annual income back in 2014, you see that the Asians were receiving, their earnings were higher than anybody else. They had over 70,000 annual, followed by the white population. This is all households, Hispanic, and of course, African American. Now, one would argue that there are push and pull factors that would create such a situation to occur. But the book argues that some of this situation could be because of discrimination, especially economic discrimination. Look at this graph here, which is women minority in most parliaments. The discrimination is also linked to political participation. These are countries where women, for example, Sweden, women constitute 44% of the parliamentarians in Sweden. In Mexico, 42%. Look at the United States. Only 19% of women are in Congress. Perhaps, yes, last year it changed a little bit, but you can see that less than 20% of representatives are women. That's a problem, particularly in political representation. So when we are talking about poverty, what are we really talking about? Poverty is deprivation, meaning that there's a lack of something. We can group poverty into various segments. For example, we have absolute poverty. What does that mean? You need to understand this. Absolute poverty is a lack of basic standard of what is necessary to survive. Those who fall below this standard are considered poor. Right? If you have absolute poverty, we can measure it in calorie intake, we can measure it in money, we can measure it in whatever measure that you use, but whatever that measure is, you have absolute lack of or you have absolute deprivation that you are poor. Then the second concept is relative poverty. Relative poverty is deprivation that is relative to standard of living enjoyed by other members of society. For example, if I'm earning $70,000 a year and someone is earning $30,000 a year, one who is earning $30 a year is relatively poor compared to one earning $70,000 a year. Poverty line, or sometimes called poverty threshold, is the minimum level of income deemed adequate in a particular country. The UN has established at least $2 a day as at least the basic income when you are living in developing countries. Another concept that we need to remember is residual welfare. This refers to serving the poorest of the poor. As I mentioned before, is that according to the American value is that you have to be self-reliant, independent. If you cannot, then your family will help you. If your family cannot help you, you go to your community. The government is the residual welfare provider, means you can only go to the government as a last resort. The why and how effective altruism. This is a YouTube clip that has Peter Singer, who is an atheist, explaining about why we need to be altruistic. I think it's a very controversial video. Please watch it if you have the time to do that. I would encourage you that you do it. So there are theoretical formulations on poverty. And as I said before, poverty is very elusive. Means we have just not grasped how to handle it. But people who live in poverty fall into three categories. One, we have those who are working poor, they're earning minimum wages, and you know why they're working poor. They're working poor because they're not paid, at least relative wages, or that, they're working part-time. The second category is the unemployed, those who are willing to work, they're able-bodied, but they cannot find work. And the third category is those with human capital deficits, the people who have poor health, poor education, or lack of training, lack of skills. We call them human capital deficits. Charles Murray, 1994, basically argued that socioeconomic inequality was due to a lack of genetic intelligence. Very controversial, but read about his theories. And this is one of the things that are very controversial, because people can have so many explanations of why situation occur the way it occurs. But I think that's a test question that we need to recall. Culture of poverty, what does it mean? The experts say that that theories maintain that poverty and poverty traits are transmitted intergenerationally. That's what it means by having a culture of poverty, intergenerational poverty, meaning that if you are born from parents who are poor, chances are that you are going to be poor yourself, because you don't have those skills that are transferable, you don't have resources that you can be able to get to maintain from your parents, things. When discussing poverty, attention has just been given by politicians on politics and ideology over knowledge. However, we know through science and through study that low wages, rising income inequality, structural economic change, for example, job relocation to other countries, or purchasing goods that are cheap, kills industries. Here, we know that we have political disenfranchisement of working class people, labor markets, all those conditions could cause poverty, but we don't necessarily attend to those conditions for whatever reason, because perhaps it's not politically convenient. These are important takeaway points that you need to remember. I think some of these are part of your test questions. So these are important facts. Fact number one, the rural poor are more likely than the urban poor to live in chronic long-term poverty, right? That's almost like a fact that people really ignore, that poverty is concentrated in the rural areas. Two, public assistance programs provide only maintenance and not accumulation of assets. When you watch Professor Arroyo's clip, she's going to be giving you some of these things that are pushed forward about the welfare queens, that people who are on welfare earning so much money, they're rich, they're mulching on the poor. No. What this tells you is that public assistance only provides maintenance, not make people rich. Three, traditional poverty measures are inadequate to quantify poverty. The way we have quantified poverty, those things are inadequate, especially today. Sometimes how we measure supplemental poverty measures is better measured because it accounts for the cost of living, which varies from part of the country to another. That means how we measure poverty, we also have to account for the cost of living geographically. For example, the cost of living in Texas might be different from the cost of living in New York or California. But the current measures do not account for those differences. A member of radical group would argue that poverty results from capitalists depressing wages to exploit poor workers, right? That's almost a radical group, but today actually it has become almost like mainstream, especially in the liberal wing of politics. So study also all these other important facts, because these are facts that are in the book and you might be tested in your quiz this week. Look at this graph, which basically shows the number of poverty rate between 1959 and 2011, maybe 2019 right now, just don't have a most current one. This number, this line shows that from 1959, almost 40 million people were poor. Then it dropped in 1970. Try to think about what was going on in 1970 that it dropped. This was the collapse of oil industry at the time. Then 1980 started climbing up a little bit. 1985, 1990, then it went up in the 1990s. Figure out who was in office around this time. And then it has been climbing. Right now we have about 50 million Americans who are poor. These are the percentages. And as you look at this poverty rate percentage line, you see that poverty has always been hovering around 15%. Really, this is where it has been. And the question is, how come the United States has not been able to solve the problem of poverty? And you are the policy analysts, you are the experts, try to figure out how to, why is that condition the way it is for so many years, and we know right now we have capability of understanding it, but we have not been able to solve it. Here you see relative poverty rate in the United States compared to other OECD countries. I told you relative poverty is, poverty compared to your neighbors, to other people. For example, in Denmark, poverty rate is about 6%. Look at the United States, 15%. That's what the other figure was showing. So some of these countries, like the Nordic countries, have been able to at least narrow their poverty gap. They are not as rich as the United States. What is it that they are doing that maybe we here aren't doing? Look at child poverty rate in selected countries. In Iceland, it's only less than 5% among children. In Finland, it's 5%. Look at poverty in the United States. Children are poor. So many children are poor. Almost 17% of children are poor. What is it that we cannot be able to figure out how to reduce poverty among our most vulnerable populations? This one tells you about the recession, 1973-1974 recession, and its impact. Basically, when I was showing you the other graph, I showed you why the graph dipped around 1970s because of the recession that was taking place around the time. The book talks about Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act of 1996. I want you to focus a little bit on this act because it might give you some ways of how I want you to analyze your policy paper. In signing this law, President Clinton famously proclaimed that the act would end welfare as we know it. So, what is Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act? If you were to analyze this policy, this is what you would say. You would say that, first of all, you describe it. It's basically a job program designed to move the able-bodied adult poor into the workforce. Basically, that's what the goals were. It has seats limited to 5 years for able adults. It provides some help with childcare and healthcare. Most benefits are non-cash. So these are almost like the 4 goals for Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act. So if you are analyzing this policy, I would like you to spell out these goals, because it is from these goals that you can go back and check whether each of these goals has been achieved or not. It uses strong sanctions to punish applicants and recipients who are found in non-compliance with the rules. Now, you may not get this particular fact in the Act, but you can go outside the Act to check in the literature, and you can see how people have looked at it. And basically, they have concluded that it uses punitive measures. It doesn't actually or so much help. 2, it employs a range of policies including DNA testing, income garnishment, license forfeiture, and fines. So if you are analyzing this, I'll look deep into the policy itself and I'll find that. 3, it denies benefits to almost all legal immigrants. Now, this is what it does when you look deep into the Act. In 1996, the TANF, Temporary Aid to Needy Family, caseload was 12.6 million. This was before the Act was passed. In 2010, it was 4.2 million. Almost, how many people? Almost over 10 million people were pushed off welfare caseload. Not because the policies worked very well, but because the qualifications to getting these benefits were very stringent. That's what you need to do when you're analyzing such a policy. So in summary, when you're analyzing it, you say, well, it has reduced the caseload, but it has not reduced the American rate of poverty, which is true. It has proven unresponsive to downtowns in the economy, which is also very true, because basically said, well, you cannot get benefits unless you prove that you have been seeking for work. But there's no work. Companies are not hiring, so it didn't take care of that. Most of the poor adults who have left the welfare rolls have become the employed poor. That means that they are working, but they are working poor because they are forced to work for low wages. They are forced to work part-time, but that's what the law requires them to do that. So I need you to basically analyze the law in that sense as you are reviewing. So what's the problem? The problem is that the flaw in it is that we are only treating symptoms rather than the causes of poverty. Right? So read a little bit more about that. The book also discusses about who makes up the poor. Right? The poor are those who have limited education, occupation, place of residence. But we know that poverty can be fixed. It's not a permanent state. Read more about that as you revise. Working and poverty. This is some of these are self-explanatory. We know how many people in America are poor. The book explains more a little bit about that. Who are the working poor? Read more a little bit about who the working poor are. I think the book can explain that very well. Percent of working families below 200% poverty by race. See that graph, who among race and ethnicity who is more poor than others. The poverty pipeline, what does it mean? Read a little bit about that. The book explains very well, and the notes will also give you some ways of how to know what poverty pipeline is. Here, basically, the slide is just talking about how our education system has failed Americans. And maybe if we start thinking about poverty, we may need to look at our education system. So study a little bit about that. The quality of schools that we have, what research has found about what we can do in our schools and education system to reduce poverty. Read a little bit about that, especially the work of James Heckman and Associates. Read more a little bit about how he argues about it. We also have most effective programs that have been able to be put forward to deal with poverty. Try to read a little bit about those programs. This one basically talking about, failure to consider the impact of poverty and disadvantages of the poor. So I will stop here because I just think that the book explains very well, and the PowerPoint should be able to give you more information. Have a wonderful week. And again, if you have any questions or anything that you need to ask the class. We are always ready to answer your questions. Bye-bye. Have a wonderful week.